Hi, this is Victoria Nalule, and here with me again is Professor Volker Roeben from the University of Dundee. In the first video, we talked about sustainability in the energy sector. In this video, we shall tackle climate litigation. But before we start, I would like Professor Roeben to introduce himself again.
Yes, I am Professor Volker Roeben, and I'm a professor of energy law and global regulation here in Dundee and at the Center for Energy, Petroleum, Mineral Law and Policy.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. In this video, we want to tackle climate litigation, and I'll start by asking you to give us a brief overview of climate litigation. What does it mean? And yes, what does it mean, and what's the brief overview for people out there who would like to know more about it?
Yeah, climate litigation is a really recent phenomenon. What it means is that as the world is becoming aware of the need to protect the climate, this is not just a task for the states, for all states who signed up to treaties, in particular the Paris Agreement in 2015. But it becomes an issue of really within every state, the domestic level. So individuals and also non-governmental organizations are taking the initiative of holding important players to account before courts. That is what we call climate litigation. And it is a phenomenon that you can observe now really in most, if not all, states. You see this in the United States, you have seen this in Europe, but you also see this in Asia. The idea is really that climate change concerns all of us, and therefore it is also a question of everyone holding the relevant players to account. Now, when I talk about relevant players, those are the so-called carbon majors, the big corporations that use a lot of energy and produce a lot of carbon. On the one hand, but it's also the states who are, each of them, accountable to introduce policies that combat climate change, reduction targets, and also new policies about renewables. Now, one example that illustrates this very clearly is, for instance, a case that was just decided in the Netherlands. It was brought by a group called Urgenda, and they brought an action, a legal action, in a Dutch court, arguing that the Dutch government had not set targets high enough or stringent enough to really meaningfully combat climate change. And this is the first case, really, where you can see a national court saying to its own government, what you have done is not enough. You need to be more ambitious. And that was seen by many as a revolution in the way we really use international law, where all these targets eventually are set, in a domestic setting, in the so-called climate litigation setting. Now, Urgenda is clearly a very important example. It's not the only one at all. You have similar cases in the United Kingdom and in Ireland, and you have also cases, in many cases, in the United States, where citizens are bringing such actions against state and federal governments for more ambitious, more stringent action to combat climate change. Now that is the one strand of climate litigation, where you see, as I said, citizens and holding the governments to account. But we will also see, and that's already on the horizon, such action against corporations about the so-called carbon majors. One case that is very interesting is, for instance, concerns a Peruvian farmer in Peru, who lives quite up in the mountains, and there is a lagoon that threatens the village where that farmer and others live. Now, a consequence of climate change will be that lagoon, which is at the end of a glacier, will overflow at some point. So this farmer and his support are bringing cases in Europe, in this case against Germany, against a German company that is one of these carbon majors that emits a lot of carbon dioxide. And it's an amazing experience for a lawyer to see this, and there are lots of very difficult legal questions, including whether you can actually show there is causation, a chain of events between the emissions on the one hand and then the overflow of the lagoon that destroys the livelihood of that farmer before a court of law. These questions are being asked in a very serious manner, and at Dundee, for instance, we will have a major workshop that is open to students and PhD students later this year, where all of these questions will be explored. We will invite some key judges involved in these cases, as well as the legal representatives of some of the claimants. As I said, students and PhD students are invited, and we hope to have a very interesting discussion and possibly ultimately arrive at some ideas about where a global consensus, or at least a European or international consensus, could lie in terms of this climate litigation.
Thank you very much. Those are very interesting developments in climate litigation. Now I'll go on to the last question. It being a new phenomenon, what are the prospects and challenges of climate litigation?
Yeah, it is, as you say, a new phenomenon, and that makes it exciting to work in the field. Because we don't really know whether it will be successful, except for this Urgenda case that I mentioned, where you have seen success. But I think the prospect of it is probably a matter of higher chances of success than we have ever seen this type of action, because generally awareness is growing that this is action against climate change is urgent. It is paramount, and if you want to, citizens are coming to the conclusion that this cannot be left just to governments to sort out. So they want their governments to be held to account in a court of law for whether they are doing enough and fast enough, most importantly. So the prospects are very dynamic, and some of the very important law firms, international law firms, are getting involved in this field on both sides of the debate, to be honest. And therefore, if you are an aspiring young lawyer, an energy lawyer, this is certainly a field where much demand already exists, and there will be even more demand in the future. So all the skills you could learn here would help you to become a very effective player in this very important field.
And then what are the challenges? Do you think it will be successful at the moment? What are the challenges of enhancing climate litigation?
Yeah, the key challenge, I think it's fair to say, is to demonstrate that there is what we call a chain of causation. That will hold up in a court of law. Where on the one hand you can show that there is a major emitter, and we know there aren't really many in the world. It's a limited group, but they contribute disproportionately to the overall carbon emissions around the world. And whether there is a so-called causation, that means a cause and effect between these emissions on the one hand and the effects we are seeing very far away from the place where the emissions have taken place. As in this case of the Peruvian farmer, you have a company in Europe that emits carbon, and via the process of climate change, there are effects in South America, where you now see that glaciers are melting. I mean, that's a general fact. We know that glaciers are melting at a high speed. And in that case, in the Andes in Peru, you actually then have the water level of a basin at the foot of this glacier rising. So it will eventually it will start overflowing and destroy eventually the villages at the foot of this mountain. So people who have been living there for generations will lose their livelihood really. And that's almost certain to happen. And therefore we have this Peruvian farmer now bringing in action, asking for additional protective measures to stop this overflow from happening. It's pretty obvious that this should happen, in the sense that he clearly is a victim of something that he's not responsible for. But the key challenge that you're asking about is in a court of law to show that there is this chain of events between the emissions, the changing weather, the melting of the glacier, and then the overflowing of the water. And that's something we are working on, and as I said, this workshop that will happen later this year here in Dundee as the first of this kind will explore these questions. And these questions, and to be honest, are not just legal questions. They require what we call interdisciplinary thinking. So we will be bringing in physicists, geologists, people who have expertise in these fields, and with whom we as lawyers must then enter into a discussion. That's a challenge for us as academics, but it's fascinating. It's the only way to address this type of questions. And the students here at the center are trained very early on to think in these interdisciplinary contexts, so that they understand what the challenges of their professional lives will be. None of us, or at least not none of the younger colleagues, will be able to live just in the silo of law, for instance. They will have to understand that energy law in particular moves within a context, and you need to understand this context. You need to be aware, open to these other disciplines, and understand how they work and how they think, in order to be the best lawyer you can be, and make a difference. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That was very impressive. In the next video, we shall talk about climate change. Stay tuned.